Welcome back, everybody. We are, believe it or not, in episode 5 of the Real World Retirement Podcast. Real families, real solutions. And really our goal with this is to help educate you folks out there who are coming up on retirement. Maybe you're already retired, or maybe you're 20 years away, but really to just give you some real world tips that can absolutely help you in your financial journey. So I'm super excited. Today, I got a phenomenal guest, Mr. Joe Wilkinson, probably my favorite advisor in the Midwest. But this guy is amazing. Phenomenal father, phenomenal husband, and an absolutely wealth of information when it comes to financial planning. So I'm excited to have you here. Joe, thank you for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I always like to start off, Joe, kind of talk to the audience. What's your story? Why'd you get into this? What got you to be a financial advisor? Why do you love what you do? What are you passionate about?
Yeah, so I became an advisor. I first got licensed in 2013, and it was kind of a long road for me to get here. And it was one of those things where I didn't realize why I was doing it until I started doing it.
Okay.
I remember I met my wife, Katie, in 2010, and her dad was an advisor at Edward Jones. And he had met me like 3 times, and he was like, dude, you should absolutely do this job. You're built for it. And I was like, whatever. I didn't do it. And I was working in tax and accounting at the time, and then had went to a tech startup and worked there for about 9 months. And after about 6 months there in that culture, I was like, all right, let's get serious about this. What does it look like? And so, he brought me in and, taught me what a bond was. And I didn't even know what it was at that point. Right. I was just a stock guy. And, I started at Edward Jones shortly thereafter. And, when I first started, my main goal was just to provide for my family, right? I was a new dad. Eloise, my firstborn, was 6 months old when I started. And, I just went out and I hustled and I tried to meet as many people as possible. And at Edward Jones at that time, you would have to knock on people's doors.
Right,
so
right.
I did that for like 2 days, and I was like, this isn't going to work, right? And so I tried to figure out different ways to do it. And it was actually when I went to a lead service, and I talked to the owner of the company, and him and I had like a conversation, and he was like, hey, what's your why?
Yeah.
Why are you doing this? And, we started talking, and I thought about it, and I was like, went back to my childhood, and I remember, when I was in 7th grade, and the youngest of 5 kids, my parents got divorced.
Okay.
They got divorced because my dad was not good with money, right? He made enough that he was an administrator at a public school. My mom was a teacher, but they had 5 kids and lived in Ann Arbor, right? It wasn't a cheap place to live. And at some point, it got caught up where, we could no longer afford to keep our house. They didn't stay married. So in 7th grade, I had to switch schools. My parents divorced, moved into a really small condo with my mom and sister at that time. And that was sort of like the essence of what pushed you to get interested in this. Because I remember my Aunt Karen, who was always a savvy investor and very successful woman, came up to Michigan from Florida, helped me furnish my room, helped us furnish the place. And when she was leaving, she gave me a Janus Henderson mutual fund book and a subscription to the New York Times. And she was basically like, hey, you better learn this or else you're going to be on that road. And, when I started thinking about that, I was like, if I had knocked on my dad's door 30 years ago and he listened to me,
yeah,
he never would have filed bankruptcy. My parents might have still ended up apart, but it wouldn't have been for that reason.
Right. I
wouldn't have went through this life that I lived that, for a couple of years was really tough, a lot of struggles. And, my high why, as I call it, is if I can stop that cycle for my people,
yeah,
then I've fulfilled my purpose as an advisor. And
I love that.
I think a lot of people think, a financial advisor, I have to be rich to talk to one. You don't.
Right.
Like if you're a kid starting out with $100, I'll talk to you, tell you what to do. I won't take you on as a client, but I'll tell you what to do. And for me, it's just, I can help anybody if they're willing to listen and do the work.
Absolutely. That's a powerful story. And it's interesting because to your point, it's so funny because, as I've obviously been in the business and met a lot of different financial advisors, it's like it's usually a very close proximity of something happening to a parent, a grandparent, or whatever. And it's like, and I always use that reference of like, it's like the long-term care thing for us as advisors. People usually don't ask unless they've watched it happen to their parents. You know what I'm saying? Like that close proximity to something taking place for you. So that's an amazing story, and obviously tells a lot about the passion that you bring, to your clients, to the business, and overall. Like again, and I somebody wouldn't know this out here, but like your moral compass around the business is so strong, and it makes a lot of sense that it feeds back into that relationship with your folks.
And I think at the end of the day, my moral compass and my view on ethics is: would you do this for your mom?
Right.
Absolutely. If the answer is no, then you don't
do it. Yeah, it's that easy.
Unless you hate your mom, but I love my mom.
Right. So. Right. So I know you brought a pretty unique and a very powerful case study of a family. And so, when we talk about the 4 seasons of investing, that's really the topic of today, the 4 seasons of investing. And we're really basically breaking down, from when you're an early earner to in your peak accumulation years, to that retirement transition, and then lastly, that kind of legacy handing the money off, right? So there's kind of, when we look at it as professionals, we're breaking people's, age, situation into these 4 seasons, which help us give advice on what they should and should not be doing, right? Now, this case study that I think we're going to start with technically drops into the 3rd season. Yeah. Somebody's retiring, they're in retirement, and what that looks like. So if you don't mind kind of jumping into the story of, I know
it's going to come.
I know it's a heartstring. So if you want to tell that, I think that'd be a great place for us to start.
Yeah, so I was at Plymouth, Michigan, community center. I did a Social Security seminar, and in the audience there was a guy. You if you grew up around people that were old, or you've ever watched somebody go, you can kind of tell that guy's close to going home. And so he was there with his wife, and it was me and Laura, back when Laura used to do seminars, and they booked an appointment, and Don had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And, he was such a cool dude, nice guy, not afraid to go. I think at a certain point we all got to deal with mortality in a way, and he had his faith, and his only concern was, I want to know that my wife's going to be okay. And so, we went through our process. And, with me, typically, if someone says, hey, I need some variables to this plan, I'll build them as many plans as they need. So built them a plan and said, hey, here's what I hope happens. I hope this gets cured. I hope you live. I hope you can travel and do everything you want. And here's the bad side if that doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, right.
So we had some pretty sobering conversations, and he was like, I don't think I have that long, maybe a year left to live. I said, okay, well, let's make the best of it. And they had about $1 million, and obviously when we're talking about allocations and we're talking about risk, it's such a nuanced subject, right? Where if someone looks at me and they're like, dude, I'm gonna be gone in a year. I need you to do something for my family that I don't know how to do.
Yeah.
And so I built them the income plan, and I found product. There's lots of products out there that are available.
Right.
There's lots of different investment vehicles. But I found one where if we deposited the money into this product, they would give us 20% up front. And if he passed away, that extra 20% would go to his wife. So we ended up putting $800,000 into that, and then the other $200,000 into some growth assets. And after that meeting, man, I remember him saying, "You've given me solace to go," and he hugged me, and that was the last time I ever saw him.
Oh, gosh.
And I called him a month later, and I was like, "Hey, we have to deliver this policy to you guys. When would be a good time for you and John to meet?" And she said, "Well, his funeral was yesterday, so what do we do?" And I freaked out because I was like, oh, we didn't deliver this.
Yeah,
And
like what happened?
is it null and void? And the
Right.
company was like, no, it's good. It's in force. Everything's fine. But we made that woman $160,000 in 28 days.
Right.
You know, real money, tangible money with a death benefit that came back to her. And, you know, knowing that she got that and working with her in the years since, every time she meets me, we obviously get emotional, right?
Yeah,
I'm an emotional dude, but yeah, I mean, every time we meet, she gives me a hug, and she always just says, "Thank you. You know, you have no idea how much peace you gave to my husband. Like, if we wouldn't have came to that seminar, we wouldn't have met you. He would have died afraid."
Right.
And he didn't. And you know, for me, beyond why I started doing this, it's stories like that where, you know, your legacy is what you leave behind, and you know, everybody imagines themselves old in a bed with their wife or husband next to them, going
Right.
close together, but oftentimes that's not the way it shakes out. So for her, you know, we increased her net worth significantly. We've grown her assets since, and we've given her the ability. You know, she's like, "Well, I want to keep working." You don't have to at this point, right? We've replaced a couple of years of gains, you know, from your income plan growing at that rate, and you know, that one just always sticks out to me because, you know, you can grow people's assets and they don't even say thank you. You can beat the market. They don't say thank you.
Right,
You can save them from absolute catastrophe. You can fix their taxes. You can do all these things, but seldom do you have somebody that like is genuinely like, you changed my life. And we change lives every day, but very seldom do you get that recognition.
Correct.
And you know, that'll always stick out to me. And I'm thankful that I was the person that was able to help them because it changed the way I looked at a lot of stuff too.
Yeah, and you know, it's like the way I see that from like a third party. Obviously, I'm in the business and I deal with it too, and I know exactly what you're talking about. But like, you know, what I would say again, if you're somebody out there listening and there's a medical situation in your family with your spouse, with a parent, the most important thing, and I beat this drum all the time. It's like you don't know what the options are unless you're educated on those options. And so if you're somebody out there who, you know, that story pulls a heartstring, again, I just want to encourage you, please reach out to us, engage with us. One of the things, and you know, we got guys and gals with hearts just like gold all around here who genuinely want to do the right thing and are our fiduciaries. And that's the technical term, but really it's just about having a strong moral compass. And, you know, and I would go out on a limb and ask this, they probably had no idea those type of products and investments existed, correct?
No clue.
And unless you're in the business, you're not going to know. And then here's the other side of that story. There's thousands of them. Who's the best one? Who's the worst one, right? Like that's the type of stuff that it's our job to sift through, to give you, the family or the person, that type of advice to say, hey, here's kind of the top 3. This is why I'm going through these, and this is where I think it makes sense. And then giving you the ability to make an educated choice. So if you feel that's you or you have questions around that, again, it could be a parent, it could be a brother, a sister, a coworker, a child, or your spouse. Please engage with us. You know, make sure you're liking us on social media, Foguth Financial Group. But also, do not hesitate. Send us an email, drop us a comment, a message on social, whatever's easiest for you, because these are the type of conversations like Joe's kind of highlighting that allow us to make a big impact in people's life, but you don't know it unless you open that door, right? You got to take a step and open that door. So I just like to encourage that because, again, I know all the stories I've had, Joe, in the same light. That one is very rare for the simple fact it happened so fast.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
The crazy thing about it is, you know, there's so many things out there that'll promise that.
Yeah.
But there's stipulations and guidelines, and you know, if you're using certain types of investments for certain reasons, there's a lot of caveats that can be had inside of those contracts. And you know, we specifically researched it. I think I even talked to you about this one. I was like, hey, I need something where, like, if he goes in the first year, it's still valid.
Right. And I know we even brought Mike, CEO,
we brought Mike into it, yeah.
And went A, to verify, but then B, on the back end, making sure they did what they said they were going to do.
Yeah, and they did. And, yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of time that goes by where I don't think about that family. And, you know, it's an interesting job because, sometimes people just see a dude in a suit, and I always tell people, if I'm at a
He's running
seminar
stocks,
in a suit, this is the only time you'll ever see me in one. I'm a regular guy.
Yeah.
And helping them and helping everybody is, equally important, but that story just really sticks out.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, man.
Yeah.
That's a powerful story. And again, getting back to the whole real world that's a real world scenario. You have to have a tough conversation with somebody. Nobody likes talking about dying.
Yeah.
That's not a fun conversation. I won't share the whole story, but I had a very similar case where, I sat down with the family and they're like, hey, he's terminal. He's going to be dead in 2 years. How do we claim our Social Security, maximize it? What type of investments do we put it in? That's the stuff where there's a ROI on that knowledge that we've had. And most of it comes through experience.
Yeah.
You do something a couple thousand times, a couple hundred times, you're like, okay, I get it. Right. But it's not like, I always joke around with clients whether it's a nurse or a firefighter or an executive, if I were to step into your office, I'm lost.
Yeah.
I don't expect you to be an expert.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So let's kind of go back to the 4 seasons of investing. So that's kind of a third season. Somebody's retired and they have a medical situation. And again, we could dive into that. But let's start with season 1 of life, right? You get a new job. You're starting to make money. What are some tips and advice and some best practices that you would give to somebody, again, maybe in their 20 to 35 range, who's earning, they're not at their peak years yet, but they need to start somewhere and build a foundation? What types of advice would you give that, again, obviously the caveat is everybody's different. And we're going to do different things with risk tolerance and all that stuff. There's the asterisk. But what are some best practices you would encourage?
So my mom's dad, his family left Ukraine when he was very young, right? They were basically escaped. And famous thing my mom always said that his parents said is, the only thing nobody can take away from you is your education. So number 1, education, whether it's a trade, whether it's college, whether it's going and working under someone at a company. If you want to be successful, if you want to have money to save, you have to get educated in what you want to do, period.
Amen.
Right? Yes, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of college their freshman year. That's why there's only 2 of those guys, right? You got to figure out what you want to do and get educated on how to do it well. That's the first step. For people starting out, if you're in your 20s to 20 to 30 range, what I always thought was the best advice was, obviously, if you're at a company that's giving you a 401k, you do the 401k and you start with the Roth version of the 401k. If you think you can't afford to save money into that, you can. If at a minimum, take whatever they're going to match you. So if they say, hey, we're going to give you a 3% match if you put in 3%, put in the 3%. My recommendation would be 10%. Right. We give 10% to ourselves. If you're spiritual or religious, you give 10% to your church. It's a lot, but you get used to it. Right. And again, it's kind of like a funny story. I know someone that lost a bunch of weight. Right. I was like, how'd you do it? And they said, well, I took a plate of food that I would normally eat, and I took 20% off the plate. They lost like 100 pounds. Right. And it's inversely with wealth building. It's the same way, where we're kind of programmed to work with what we have. And once you get used to it, you make ends meet. Right. And so for the young people out there, 10%, you don't even have to get complicated. And that's one place where I see people really screw themselves up is, they go on Wall Street bets or they go online and they try to get rich quick. Right. That doesn't happen in real life for 99.999% of people.
Exactly.
You're best off going into a growth asset, investing in the S&P 500. And this happens a lot. People will send their kids into me and I'll tell them, I'll talk to your kid, but I'm not going to charge them to manage their money because they're in that growth and accumulation phase. Here's the 3 things you need to buy. Call me when you get married. You're probably going to need some life insurance. Go online and get it. I'm not going to sell it to you. I'll tell you how much to get, right? What I do and specialize in is more, once you've accumulated your assets, how can we protect them and make sure that they last beyond your lifetime, right? But in that early stage, it's really important. And for that second stage, right, because we're going to get there, but for the people listening in that second stage, right, I want my kids to have, I want my kids to not have to worry the way I worried when I was, 18 through 30. And I don't know the exact stat. Maybe we can link it later, but it's something like if you invest $3,000 a year for your kid from the age of 6 to 18 in a Roth IRA, $3,000, right? So that's a 12-year period. You're talking $36,000 versus a person that starts saving at 25, putting away like 6 or 10,000, something crazy. The person that started that early for their kids can never save money, and by the time they're 65, they will have more money than the person that started in their 20s investing more. And that to me is like, when I saw that, I was like, okay, that's a lot of money for a lot of people, but it's a worthwhile investment for your kids if you're in that second stage and trying to encourage them, on what to do.
Amen. And so first and foremost, hey, if you got a match at work, make sure you get that match.
100%.
In a perfect world, you're not taking just the match, you're doing 10%, right? Yep. And then the second thing is, okay, you did the match, you did maybe the 10%, but if your employer has a Roth option, making sure you're doing the Roth option for, obviously you and I know, but basically, hey, your IRA is tax deferred.
Yep.
Right. Your Roth IRA is tax free.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're always going to encourage that tax free dollar above that tax deferred dollar. And so think about it in light of, and one other thing that I would add too is, look at your monthly budget. And to your point, Joe, of like saying, hey, I have 10% that I'm going to be putting away, out of sight, out of mind, right? It's out of sight, out of mind. If you're used to getting it right from the get,
you're going to spend it.
You're going to spend it.
It's gone.
But if you're not used to getting it, it's wild how that stuff works. So first season of life, if we can get into a Roth, phenomenal. Make sure you're hitting the match. In a perfect world, you're doing 10%.
Yep.
And where do you invest it? A very generic. And again, if we were talking to you, one off or you want to reach out, we're going to give you a little bit more specific. But a great place to start is investing in like an S&P 500 ETF.
Yeah, so you're at your SPY or a lot of people like QQQ, which is the Nasdaq ETF.
More tech, yeah.
Yeah, and where we are in the world right now, right? And 100 years ago it was the Dow Jones. For the last 50 years it's been the S&P. Nasdaq's been kind of the darling lately because we're in a tech world and it's not really going to change unless. And it's not going to change. So, so long term, I think people need to look at long term trends, and most people aren't built to look at long term investing trends. But I've known some really successful investors in my life, and one of the best pieces of advice someone gave me is look about you, right? Look around your surroundings. What's in the fridge? What's Darius drinking right now? He's drinking a Coke,
right?
Coke owns a lot of stuff. So does Pepsi, right? There's and so what are people buying? What are people consuming? What is, what's going on in the world around you? Are those companies available for you to take ownership in?
Correct.
Right. And I think being able to do that, what I like about the S&P is it's the 500 biggest companies in America. America's had a pretty good run. I think it's going to continue. And the 500 biggest companies here are probably going to continue to be good companies to own. The big thing that people make mistakes on in investing is, 20 years ago, somebody might have said, man, Nokia makes all the cell phones. Going all in on Nokia. And Nokia might have been in the S&P 500 in that time. Now they're nobody, right? And a company that made colorful computers back then is the #1 phone supplier globally. Nobody saw that coming. So the diversification you get by just saying, you know what, I'm going to let economics handle my investments through the S&P 500, you're going to get diversification into all those companies and be an owner in all of them.
That's a great point, because one of the things I talk about with clients all the time is the seasons of investments, right? And I won't go too deep on it, but it's the concept of, a simple way to look at it is if it's cold outside, right? I'm not walking outside in a bathing suit. Oh. some Michiganders will shovel snow in shorts, right? I don't know. But opposite, hey, when it's super hot out, I'm not going outside with a parka, hat, and winter boots, right? And the market and investing is a similar note. Hey, if their interest rates are rising, it's probably not a great time to own bonds. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Bonds and interest rates have an inverse relationship, right? So understanding that, and to your point, a very easy beginner way to go about it is, hey, just keep investing in the top 500 companies in the United States And that's a pretty economically sound strategy.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think one of the biggest disservices I've seen as an advisor is, people don't understand what these target date funds are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Like when I started working, I was like, well, I'm going to get rich quickly, so I'm probably going to retire in 2030, right? Born in 1987. It's not going to happen, right? But I see people that are like, okay, I want to retire in 2040, so I'm just going to buy the 2040 fund. Like buy, don't do that, right?
Walk through how the target funds work.
So those target funds, right? Everybody wants to retire when they're 50 when they start working, and then after a while they realize that it takes more than 10% to do that, right? And so people erroneously pick these target date funds thinking, well, I'm going to retire this year. That's when I want to retire. That's not when you're going to, though. And so in those funds, they're designed for people that hit retirement age in that year. So like if I'm going to hit, 65 years old in 2052, right? Then I would pick a 2055 target date fund. That being said, as you age, those funds add bond allocation, which takes away from the equity performance. If you look at bonds over the last 20 years, they haven't really done that much, right? Especially not a bond fund, because you can't, they're picking the bonds for you. And so people that have been in those funds, I actually sat down with a couple, about 2 months ago that came to one of our Michigan events, and they're in the 2035 Vanguard Target Life Path Fund, whatever. They have made 16% over the last 5 years.
Yeah, right.
The S&P's up 26% this year, right? And so had they had someone managing it where they just said, you know what, we're going to stick with the 60-40 or the 70-30 or the 80-20 because these bonds, it's not the time to use the bonds, they would have substantially more money.
Right. And that's a perfect thing. And basically, hey, the closer you get to the year, right? So like if I pick the 2025 fund right now,
You're going to have almost all bonds.
it's almost all bonds.
Yeah.
Right. And just, again, a really simple education is bonds are the safer investment, right? Which isn't always true. They're not safer, because again, if interest rates spike, you can lose money. But equities, right, or stocks, right, S&P 500, that's more the growth category. So the closer you get to the year, the more safety and the less risk you're hypothetically taking in that fund.
Yeah. And I think, there's a great quote by Benjamin Franklin where he says, those who give up freedom for security often get neither, right? And it's very similar in investing, where if you go 100% for security, chances are you're not going to get a great, huge return like you would in equities.
Right.
That being said, there's a time and place for security.
Yes.
And it's a needed part of every portfolio. But in that young stage, if the market drops 30% tomorrow, our jobs are going to suck for a while.
Right.
We're going to have a lot of phone calls to make, a lot of scared people to talk to.
Right.
But for me personally, and for you personally,
we got time.
I got a lot of time.
I'm looking at a buying opportunity.
Windfall.
That's a buying opportunity.
It's like if you go to your favorite store and everything's 30% off, you're buying.
Right.
And so, as you cross through those seasons of life and those seasons of investing, you have to be aware of what you need to protect. And one of the old adages, was, hey, subtract your age from 100. So, I'm 37, and whatever's remaining should be your allocation to equities, or stocks, or growth, right? But I'm almost 40. I'm not going to be in a 60-40 portfolio because that doesn't align with my risk tolerance, right? And I think where a lot of people go wrong is they take this layman's advice as gospel, right? I've seen it happen 08, right? My mom listened to Susie Orman. She took her money out at the bottom and bought CDs. Right, she missed out on 5 years of riding back up the market, and and how many people did that? Right,
exactly.
Where they're better off being in it, or they're better off being protected from an '08 level event with part of their money, right? And so, when you're young. You only get to do it once, and invest the right way. It should be for growth, long-term thinking. Put it in the account. Forget that it exists. Go to work every day. Find someone you love, get married, have kids.
There you go, bang. and on that note, if risk is something that you're worried about out there, again, I'm going to encourage you, please reach out. We can kind of highlight and go over what type of investment options would make sense for you if you do have concerns about the market. Hey, what are my best safe and or safe investments, and what are the pros and cons of those? I mean, that's the conversation. That's the education piece too. So if you do have concerns about the market, again, drop us a line, send us a comment, send us a message. We're here to support you and educate you on those subjects. And it's funny because when you talk about that, I then start thinking, okay, well, let's kind of dive into the second season, right? You're now, let's just call it 35 to 55, right?
Yeah.
You're making more money. You probably may or may not have kids, so things are more expensive, right?
Yeah,
So there's a give and a take. But what are some best practices you would just kind of throw out there for somebody? And again, I know there's some similarities to that beginning part, but what are some best practices you would throw out for that kind of second season of life? Higher money coming in, probably have more opportunities for savings and investing.
Yeah. So in that second season, right, everybody's different, but if your wages are increasing and you're a homeowner, right, it's different for everybody. So my personal experience, right, I can speak to my own experience. Because again, I hate that generic.
I do too. I totally agree with that.
Buy a house.
It's so hard to give a totally blanket answer.
So in my experience, it was very tough to continue saving, acquire a house, get married, have kids. And it wasn't until this career really started getting rolling that I was able to do these things. So I speak on it from a point of privilege, and it's a blessing.
Right.
But for me and for people I advise that are in this period, you have to commit to, almost like when you're working out, right? Like if you have a personal trainer, your next lift is going to be heavier than your last one, right? And you're going to get better results and you're going to get to where you want to go faster. When most people are exercising, they pick the weight they're comfortable with and they stay there their whole life and wonder why they're not getting results, right? It's very similar with investing in the sense that if you keep it at that 10%, sure, you're going to be fine. But like if you move it up to 11 over a 1 year period and then 12, like if you say, hey, over this time period where I'm 35 to 45, I want to go from 10 to 20.
Right.
Right. By the time you're at that 45th year, you'll now be at 20%. And you'll have conditioned yourself to get used to it. You might even be maxing out your 401k at that point. More than likely you will be if you make over six figures. And so conditioning yourself to get to that point is important. And the sooner you start doing that, right, the sooner you're going to be better off.
Yeah.
For people with kids, I mean, the 529 is huge. For some people, they use whole life or universal whole life. We can get super into the weeds on that, but again, I think
just a blanket,
it's kind of like when I tell people about Roth conversions. I'm like, there's actually a lot of other strategies, but we're not going to get into that during a seminar. So to keep it simple, invest something for the children, right?
Yeah.
It can be in a non-qualified, uniform transfer to minors account, 529. They all have different things that are going to be beneficial. But if your family is the type of family where the kids have to go to college, have to graduate college, and that's what you require and want as a parent, then it's the 529. The benefit of the 529 is if your kid, says, you know what, Dad, I want to be an electrician, or I want to be a plumber, or I want to go to dance school in New York, whatever. All of that money can still be used for all those things, right? So those are all, that's like like the big thing I say, if you have kids, make it happen. And I mean, when Eloise was born, just side story, my daughter got diabetes when she was 18 months old. We had just bought a new big house. I had a new car and thought I was like living high on the hog. I'm like, life's great. And then pow, my wife stops working. And I emptied an IRA at that point. And so one of the things I learned at that point, right, was everything shouldn't go into the Roth and the IRA. So I know I say save 10% into the Roth IRA, but also have some money in a savings account or a brokerage account where, everybody likes to think there's not going to be this bad event, but it happens sometimes. Yeah. And, nothing hurt more than me taking an IRA I'd worked for 10 years down to zero just to keep my house and to keep my car. But during that time period, the one thing I never stopped funding was the 529. Because I was just like, I'm not a good dad if I'm not doing something for my daughter. My son now has the same deal. So those two things are big. The other thing that's big, and during that 35 to 50 stage, you're still in that accumulation phase. But there's going to be a point, probably closer to 50, depending on where you fall and where the market's at, where there's a year that just makes you want to throw up. All right. That's when the protection stage begins. That's when that season begins. And it's to say there's 4 seasons, right? That if you live to 100, there's four quarters basically.
Right.
When you're in that second quarter, you should still be focused on accumulation. You should still be focused on equity style investing. And it's probably at the later part of that where you want to go build a relationship with a professional, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you should have one already if you went and got life insurance or things like that should be part of that cycle that people are going through.
Yeah, and for me, one of the things I always talk about with kind of that accumulation phase, because I'm 40 years old, right? We're in that kind of.
Was that your birthday
right?
party?
That's right. We're in that phase, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, one of the things I always talk about, a lot of times clients will be like, "Hey, will you talk to my kid?" I've told him 50 times, but hearing it from another voice who's in the boat, it usually lands differently. And I usually outline, "Hey, here's kind of 6 or 7 things you can do."
Yeah.
Right. Take the match. You can max out your Roth or your 401k. Then you go into like a non-qualified brokerage account, right? Where that's where the capital gains and all that. But that's kind of like that can be an extra emergency bucket.
Absolutely.
Doesn't have the 59.5 rule, right?
Yep.
Then you get into real estate investing. Hey, are you interested in rentals? Are you looking at the Airbnb market? I know my wife and I have obviously gone deep into that. And so I talk to a lot of people about that. Then the insurance. Hey, index universal life, whole life, right? All those other insurance policies. And then lastly, there's like the private placement piece, right? Hey, I got a buddy open up a coffee shop, or you're doing something that, again, is more like, those are high risk because you don't know if they're going to make it or not.
Yeah.
But we start going through like the list of, hey, where are all your options, right?
Yeah.
Like what can you do? So then let's go to the third season, and hey, you're close to, you're nearing retirement or you're retired.
Yeah.
To your point, I couldn't agree more. That's when you definitely want to start talking to a professional because 100%. Now it matters more than ever. You don't get do-overs, right? Like, it's a joke, but it's a harsh reality. You get this wrong, you're either going back to work or you're moving in with the kids, and neither of those are great options.
Nobody wants either of those things.
Yeah, nobody wants that, right?
Yeah.
So, I would say the third and the fourth season, we could probably spend 2.5 hours on each.
Yeah.
But maybe 1 or 2 tidbits that you'd say, hey, you're walking into retirement. I know one of the things I always say is like, hey, if you can minimize losses for the first 10 years of your retirement, your probability of success, aka not running out of money, goes way up, right? So like that's one thing that I talk about. What would be, hey, you're retiring, you're close to retirement, you just retired. What would be a couple things that you would throw out to make people think about, hey, I should be doing this, or should not be?
We break this down into 4 seasons in this episode, but wealth accumulation, from a planning perspective, there's accumulation, protection, distribution, right? When you're in that, third season, you are now officially in the protection phase, all right? And so you more than likely have or are close to paying off debts. You're more likely having better cash flow. Your kids are probably moving out. You're done saving for college, right? It's at that point where you put savings into overhaul, right? Where you start, if you haven't maxed out or you're not used to it, where you start doing that, right? For the final 10 years. When you get to those first 10 years of retirement, I couldn't agree more. Loss mitigation is humongous. And we talk about this in our seminars. You can look at return sequencing risk, and for a dude that retired in the year 2000, let's say, right? If that guy retired in the year 2000 and he had his money in the S&P 500, right? He wouldn't have gotten back to where he started from, taking nothing out until 2013. That's 13 years.
The lost decade.
Yeah. So like, if you retired at 65. You would be 78 by the time, if you retired with $1 million, that you got back to $1 million sitting in the S&P 500
and didn't take a nickel out.
Yeah, and people say you can't beat the S&P 500. I say, well, you also don't want to get beat up by it, right?
Yes.
And so growth is going to be your friend for your whole life, but your money replaces your employer. And so if you've ever had a crazy boss, those aren't great places to work sometimes versus a stable employment situation, right? That's what you're creating for yourself. Great in those first 10 years. And when I look at that distribution phase, right? If God gives us a long time on this planet, which some people get and some people don't, right? If I get 30 years in retirement, 65 to 95, right? Then there's 3 phases of retirement as well. And so, you're going to have those first 10 years. The way I like to advise people is, hey, this is when you're going to be like living it up the most. And God willing, that second 10-year period, you get to do it too, right? I'm watching my mom age. She works out every day. She runs. She does yoga. She goes to church. She's a deacon. She's in great shape. She's getting that second 10 years because of the choices she made. But also in setting up for retirement, we wanted to make sure, hey, we need to make sure that money's there if you are to get to 95. And so in a 30-year period, right, when people invest in their 30s, they say, oh, well, I'm not going to spend this till I'm 65, so I don't care what happens. That's a way that you should honestly look at a third of your retirement money, right? If you're retiring at 65 and your mom and dad lived in their 90s, you need to consider 30% of your money an incredibly long-term investment. The better that third does, the more likely you are going to have a legacy to set up, right? And so when I'm allocating assets for people, I'm a firm believer in, hey, you need to protect something. Here's the 7 different things that can protect your money, right? We don't need to get product specific, but there's a myriad of different ways to do it.
There's options.
And, typically what I like to figure out is, all right, when are you taking Social Security? What's that look like? A lot of people don't realize, hey, that benefit on the payment, the benefit on the paper, Medicare comes out of that, as do taxes, right? So that's not what you're going to get deposited in your bank account.
And you're talking about Social Security.
Yeah, Social Security. Right. So when that Social Security payment comes, it might say $2,500 on the page, but after Medicare and taxes come out, it might be $1,800. All right, so let's look at that from a sober perspective. If you need $60,000 and you have $1 million in a 401k, you're going to need to pull about $40,000 to $50,000 out a year. So how do we make sure that continues to happen in a stable environment where you don't need to touch your equity allocations so that they can continue to grow, right? And that's sort of what's important to me is figuring that step out. And there's so many paths to get there.
Yeah.
Right. There's so many ways. And, that's the importance of sitting down with someone who's not pushing a product, but pushing a solution to your problems.
Right.
And I tell people, hey, here's option A, option B, option C, all the way to Z, right? What do you feel most comfortable with? What makes the most sense? And what do you feel aligns with you the best? Because we can make anything work, but you have to choose something.
Yeah.
And, typically the protected part is there to provide income in down markets and to let your equities continue to go up.
Right. And so really season 3, what you're talking about is it becomes of identifying a certain portion that's going to be principal protected, right?
Correct.
Where we have no to very minimal risk.
Yep.
And part of the reasoning for that, like, how I talk about it is we don't know when there's going to be a bad year.
Nope.
So when that year comes, what you don't want to do is have to draw on those higher growth investments. Hey, accounts down 10, 20, 30%. You don't want your monthly draw coming from that.
No.
You want your monthly draw coming from the thing that didn't lose a nickel in that season, right?
Exactly.
So season 3 is really about diversification.
100%.
And identifying what's my safe bucket, what's my moderate bucket, and then what's that 30-year growth bucket.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
100%.
And so like that's one of the things, like to your point, most of the time when people start asking us to, hey, we want to sit down, we want to come up with a plan, it's like, hey, this thing's real. It's 6 months away. It's 2 years away. And it becomes real on them. And they realize, wait a minute, I don't really know, and to your point, our job isn't necessarily to tell you to do what to do with your money.
Yeah.
Our job is to educate you on the options to allow you to feel comfortable and make informed choices.
Exactly.
So 3rd season, and again, we could talk about the investments for an hour, but for sake of the podcast, we get into the 4th season of life, right? You're getting older, and it's kind of, and we work in retirement plans, so we got 1,000 jokes. The go years, right? The slow go, and then the no go. So now we're talking about the no go years, and this could be 70 to 95. This could be 85 to 90. You don't really know exactly, but it's when things start slowing down and now you're starting to plan for taxes, legacy, handing money down, making sure that you have the appropriate needs if you end up in a home. What are some advice and tips that you would give for that season?
I've seen so many people hold on to their money and not get to see the joy that it can give to their families. I have clients across the spectrum, right? So I have some clients that are like, my kids aren't going to know, but they're going to be really happy when I die. And I ask them, like, but you're not going to be here. Like, maybe you'll see it in a way, but you won't be here to see it.
Yeah.
and you deserve to, right? So like if you're able to have a legacy, and that's part of it, I think giving while alive is one of the biggest gifts that you can give yourself. Especially if you have grateful kids and grandkids. If they're ungrateful, there's a lot of great charities out there. But seeing the joy that can give, helping your grandkids pay tuition. I mean, I got this client, one of my favorite clients, I won't mention his name, but he pays for his grandson's tuition at Michigan. He bought one of his grandkids a car, and like the pride and joy that he has from being able to do that, is why he saved the money. And, I think realizing how you want, if you are able to have a legacy, right? If you're unable to have a legacy, we just got to make sure that you have enough money to continue going. But the legacy planning in that fourth period of life, taxes, trusts, all of these things are going to have different places for different types of people, right? And so, we spend a lot of time trying to help people, realize tax efficiency and tax alpha in their portfolios. There's so many different ways to do it. And like I said earlier, we start talking Roth conversions. Sometimes those Roth conversions can be like those cartoons where you're dumping water out of a boat that's filling up with water, right? Like if you're growing your assets and you're converting them, you're never going to get rid of all of your assets unless you get really aggressive and into the Roth. So there's trusts that you can use. There's different types of insurances you can use.
Right.
So on a person-to-person basis, the most basic advice I can give is these are the final years you have that we've been given, that we know of, and you should spend them doing things that give you joy. And truthfully, the more money you give to your family, the more they're probably going to want to be around you. So,
right.
Less likely to be sad there. But that, to me, I think that's like the coolest thing that I'm seeing sort of become a trend is give while I'm alive. And as a guy who's not getting anything from my parents, my dad always says, I want you to be sad when I die, so nobody's getting anything, right? Being able to do that is like my ultimate goal.
Me too.
At the end of the day, like that's what motivates me is like, I want to make sure that what I've worked so hard for creates a legacy of generational wealth. And if that's in the cards for you in that fourth season of life, truthfully, that's when an advisor and a team of advisors do their best work, in my opinion.
I couldn't agree with that more. And to your point, it's like, there's multiple things going on at that end there. Because usually by that time, the writing's on the wall, right? You look at your accounts, you look at what they're spending, you look at averages on growth, and you're like, this is ballpark where we're going to land. You're not getting through it.
Yeah.
And so what things can we do, whether it's an experience, it's helping your kids or your grandkids out, like that's the fun stuff to your point. Like that's the fun conversations to have. And then the fun part for us is coming up with the investment strategy and the tax planning, which, tax planning is a tough one because listen, I'm not a CPA. You're not a CPA. I'm not an attorney. You're not an attorney. Unfortunately, though, we have these conversations and we know enough to be dangerous and bring the right people in to give the right solutions to where, hey, if we can minimize your taxes
absolutely,
and do it in an absolutely legal and planned manner, that's probably a conversation you should be having, right?
Yeah,
is it's not about, hey, I'm a law-abiding American, but if you had to pin me down and say, hey, Alex, would you prefer more of your money goes to the government or would you prefer more of your money go to your family? I mean, of course you're going to pick your family.
I think everybody, no matter their
and that would be my take, right?
Pick their family, yeah.
And so it's important we have these conversations because a lot of people, again, it's the same thing we always say. How are you going to play a game that you don't know the rules to play?
Yeah.
And that's where we come into that
and the other side of that is, how are you going to play a game where the rules are consistently changing?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I talk with so many people that have no idea that in 2026 in Michigan, retirees are no longer going to have to pay state income tax.
Yes.
And they act like I'm like their savior for giving them this Googleable information, But yeah, I mean, the laws change all the time. Administrations change all the time. And very seldom do I see a retiree who is reading that information, right? You want to do exactly what we're talking about, enjoy your life, and that tax planning piece. What I always tell people is they're like, when they come in and we expose their tax problem, right? We say, hey, you got a tax problem, which is the better of the two problems you can have in retirement,
Right.
but nonetheless a problem. They're like, why didn't my CPA stop this? Like, well, your CPA's job is to look at this year's taxes, and the fiduciary and the planner's job is to look at the future and help you in a legal, moral, and ethical way mitigate those taxes, right? There's tens of thousands of pages of tax code, and about 100 of them are on how to pay your taxes.
Right.
So, it can happen for the regular hardworking American person that's W-2 employee. You can follow the same rules that Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos are following. You just have to know how to follow them. And to me, like, there's this article that I read a long time ago when I was like, why am I doing this? What value am I providing? It said the average financial advisor adds about 3% of value to your portfolio for every year you work with them. Whether it's through tax advice, whether it's through minimizing investing mistakes, whether it's through efficiencies they create, whatever, right? When we do this Roth math, I see people saving 70% of what they would have paid in taxes, like hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars. And, that provides value, and that allows you to create that legacy. And again, I think, besides love, that's the best gift you can give to your kids and grandkids.
Absolutely. And it's funny because I remember I showed a report once to somebody on the Roth stuff. And they're like, is this legal? They were like, is this legal? I was like, it is 100% legal. And they're like, why would the IRS allow this to keep taking place? Now, obviously, I don't work at the IRS and I don't want to pretend. But the other side of that coin, when you think of it, is like, well, they're like, hey, you're paying me the tax now. I will take that.
Yeah, it's like J.G. Wentworth.
Yeah, exactly.
Give me my money. I want it now.
Give me my money now. Like, I don't think, I don't know this, but I'd imagine the government doesn't have a problem with paying that tax. So, kind of wrapping up, we've kind of gone through the 4 seasons of investing throughout somebody's life cycle. Is there any kind of, again, best practices or tips or kind of closing statements that you think would be important that the audience would hear, just knowing the wealth of information and how many people you've helped?
Again, I think we kind of covered them, but, don't get caught up in the day-to-day movements of the market. I mean, you're investing with the trend over a very, very long period of time, God willing, right? Mm-hmm. If you're starting at 25 and you've got a 40-year window,
right?
Who cares what happens in the market tomorrow? If you're 60 and you're retiring in 2 to 5 years, 10 years, whatever, the day-to-day starts to matter more, right? And everything starts to matter more as your time gets shorter, which is why, I stress to people, hey, if you're 5, 10, even 15 years out from your goal date of retiring, if it's not me, just make sure it's somebody that follows that moral, ethical, legal guideline, and you'll be in great hands. Now, I think the biggest thing that changed my life was, what I went through as a young man, and the advice that my aunt and mom gave me, just coming from their backgrounds of save 10%, get an education, was the best advice I ever got, even if I didn't follow it that closely. It took me a while to get to 10% because, I graduated college right after the Great Recession, and it was tough, right? Those are my biggest pieces of advice, and I think don't beat yourself up, right? If you're not making a lot of money in your first job, don't be afraid to get a new one. If you're late to the game in retirement, if you've gone through a divorce, if there's so many circumstances we see, there's literally always a path to get you to your goal.
Right.
And again, I like to make the references to working out, right? Like the best thing someone can do to lose weight is get off the couch. The best thing that you can do to retire or to get to your financial goals is to start just doing something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing that I know you have been a big advocate for anybody, staff at the company, people you're talking to, your clients, is also take the manual piece out of it and set it up to where it's a monthly occurrence. It's automated, right? We live in, we live in the future.
We are living in the future.
And you can click a button and set it up to where it automatically happens. So make sure that whether it's biweekly, monthly, quarterly, you have something set up with those savings and that investing that's taking place so you don't have to manually do it. You don't have to manually go write a check. Like those are the little things that are going to land, whether you're 20 or whether you're 65 and you got 5 years left, wherever you are. Make sure you're taking that manual component because life happens, and this is never going to be your top priority. You have a job, you have a family, you have things you want to go enjoy. This isn't going to be something that, unless you're hyper organized, which, God bless those folks who are. But that would be one thing I would also just add is that I know Joe's always been a big component of is set it up to where it automatically takes place. Don't be doing it manually. So wrapping up episode 5, the real world retirement here. I hope you're enjoying this journey with us. I hope you're getting some good stuff. First and foremost, I want to thank you, Joe.
Absolutely.
For sharing your story and pouring a little bit of knowledge out on us. Yeah. And we'll see you next time. Real World Retirement. Make sure you're engaging with us. Follow us. Make sure if you have questions, anything that we're talking about, if you have a specific question, do not hesitate to send to us, again, in an email. Connect with us on social media. We are here. We are available, and we love what we do. So thank you. We'll see you in the next episode, and have a phenomenal day.
Advisory services provided by Foguth Wealth Management LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor. For additional information, visit advisorinfo.sec.gov and search 327434.